dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
Good evening. Welcome to another edition of the Queen's Grapevine. This is your host, Wallingford Lee. Tonight on the Queen's Grapevine, we're going to talk about a very, very sensitive situation that's taking place nationwide. I'm talking about race relationships. In the eve of the birthday of the Prince of Peace, Martin Luther King, we find ourselves into a turmoil of all types of situation. And we want to capture the situation and talk about it healthily as a community to get back together, because America is a great place. And as a great place, we should be able to live as brothers and sisters with minor misunderstandings. But a lot has taken place here. We've lost 2 policemen, which is something that I don't agree with, and it has hurt our community terribly. We also lost Mr. Gardner on a situation that took place in Staten Island. So we're going to have the opportunity to talk about these things today on the Grapevine. Again, they're extremely sensitive, but I think it's important and healthy that we talk about it. On the Grapevine tonight, we have 2 veterans that has been on our program. First, we have Mr. John Murphy, happens to be a veteran from the Vietnam War, and one that has been really involved in the community. And of course, we're talking about Mr. Hank Williams, professor of English right here at Hustis College, who has been on our program more than 3 or 4 times discussing various issues. Again, it gives me a great deal of pleasure and satisfaction to have both of my guests on our program to talk about something as sensitive as this is. Okay, let's start out a little bit with you, Mr. Murphy. In your thought process, what do you think is racism?
I feel racism is where you belong or sympathize with a group of people that are actually out to go after another race, in particularly with a prejudice or outright goal of like Nazis went after Jews. The KKK went after black people. You have other groups that did the same thing. The skinheads, and are like people that believe in that type of behavior. Also, you have the Panthers, the Black Panthers, that are prejudiced, and you also have, like, for example, Farrakhan. That type of belief system is like counterproductive to any civilized society.
Understood. How about you, Mr. Williams? What are your interpretation of racism overall?
Well, structurally speaking, you have to realize racism works in 2 different ways. A lot of the time, and I think this is how we're trained to see it on the media, as an individual response. In other words, one person doesn't like another person, and that's partially true. The way we're not trained to see it, which I think is the more important thing, is as a system. So basically, bias plus the institutional power to materially affect other people's lives. And those 2 pieces are key, because their bias is one thing, but without the power to actually affect people's lives, it really does not have the same type of effect. And it's also something that you need to look at in historical terms, in terms of how we got here and how people have been conditioned to think. So that's one of the things that I think people need to keep in mind, that you need to look at both of those things, both look at it on the institutional / systemic level, and look at it on the personal level. And if somebody personally does not like me or has bias, then it's not the best thing in the world. But honestly, if they can't materially affect my life or affect the life of an entire class of people, then it's an entirely different thing.
Interesting. We accomplished a lot, Mr. Murphy, in the 60s in terms of racism. A lot of barriers were knocked down, the voting rights. Martin Luther King did a great job, and a lot of other people did a wonderful job to suppress this type of behavior, and we accomplished a lot. And it seemed like we kind of spinning a wheel. How prevalent do you think is racism in America, in your opinion?
Racism is, I don't know, it's inherent with its human behavior. It's unfortunate that people do discriminate. We all, there is a class of discrimination, but it's to the point where it's human behavior, and some of it is taught, some of it is actually learned in the home as you grow up, and then when you become an adult, if you can't figure out for yourself what prejudice is, or this type of behavior. For example, I'll give you a personal example. I grew up terrified of the English, the British. I was told by my father that the British stuck pregnant women in Ireland during the 1700s. So when the Beatles were coming to the United States, I didn't want them to come. I thought that, who would want to be, associated with the British, We're taught things that are like basically wrong. When you actually say something, you're driving in a car, I gave an example, and if you say something about a certain race, the way they drive, right, you just influence the people in that car, especially if they're young minds. You actually inadvertently, without even doing it on purpose, taught something that, they have to unlearn or grow up when they grow up and make a better decisions for themselves. So like prejudice, I'm prejudiced against peas, for example. We all have, if that's what you're asking.
No, that's exactly what I'm asking. But can we?
Yes.
Can we grow out of it?
Oh, absolutely.
And be conscious that we offend other people and be a better person.
And everybody has prejudices. But when I got in the service, here's a typical thing. There was no color. When we were in combat and the bullets and the blood was all red, the bullets were flying. We took care of each other. Everybody was band of brothers. There was no color, I grew up watching the race riots in our country and seeing police actually sig dogs on Martin Luther King's Selma, Alabama. And that was to me, it was disgusting, right?
Very much so.
I was impressioned by that. But, as you grow up, and you find out that people are humans and, fellow citizens and brothers, you change. You actually have a different opinion no matter, growing up is one thing, becoming an adult and really looking at yourself and being honest with yourself. When I worked in the computer field, I worked with engineers from all different races. I never even noticed the difference. Not for me anyway.
Well, that's important. That's obviously that's very important. Now, Hank, let me ask you a question. How prevalent in your mind is racism in America?
Well, as of this taping, we're talking just a little bit after President Barack Obama had a fairly extensive interview with National Public Radio, and he claimed that racism had actually race relations had actually improved over the past 6 years that he's been in office. And whether or not that's true, I think is difficult to measure. In my mind, it's not. In my mind, I don't know if that's a very important assessment, because number one, how would you even measure that? And number two, that's something that in the entire 250-year history of this country, to try and measure in the span of about 6 years, to me at least, is rather silly. I think what we do know is that if you take a look at things on a structural level, in terms of wealth, in terms of educational attainment, in terms of healthcare outcomes, in terms of a lot of the social indicators that we can actually measure, you see you definitely see disparities, and they slice across racial and ethnic lines. And Black, Latino, and American Indian outcomes in just about all those indicators are far beyond that of the average white population. And obviously we have to throw class into that too. If you take a look at white people in the Appalachians, for example, then you're definitely going to see similar type of disparities. But across the board, we really need to take a look at exactly what's going on structurally, and that's why I opened it up with keeping in mind the point that you're looking at both structural and individual. So individually, things are definitely much better in this country than in the 1960s, and I think a lot of that goes back to some of what Mr. Murphy said in terms of, one, education, and quite honestly, two, experience. The example he gave of being in the Army. Quite often when you get people into situations where you can try and flatten out just about everything else, then a lot of the time people actually learn by example, and they make friendships across racial lines, across ethnic lines, across class lines. So I think that's one of the things that we need to be looking at, how can we institutionalize that sort of thing.
Well, those type of things that you talk about, I would like to say things are much better compared to what it was in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But that, when you talk about flattening, is it out of necessity that we understand one another, or out of needs?
Quite honestly, I think both. If you want to have a country that's actually going to work, then by necessity, you need to be able to figure out a system where, one, people can understand each other, two, you can at least flatten out some of the social differences between them, which in a lot of cases is causing some of the discord. And there's a lot of that has to be done at the institutional level. If you're talking about things such as education, things such as dealing with healthcare, even possibly some of the issues dealing with inequality of wealth, you can't actually legislate against bias. But what you can do is you can educate people, and you can act on the social level to try to eliminate or at least greatly reduce the things that are actually causing tensions between people and between groups.
Interesting answer, very much so. Mr. Murphy, let me ask you a question. I personally feel that we live into a multicultural society today, and I'm not sure that it's totally acceptable. What is your feeling in terms of the new society that we live into that I consider, or a lot of people consider, somewhat multicultural? You think it's better for the nation right now, or we still have ways to go?
No, I think it's a lot better for the country to be we are multicultural. It's circumstance. It's not, we are a melting pot. We're a land of opportunity. And as such, I feel that we, as the older people or the educators, should basically have a curriculum in our school systems that actually teaches what America is. I'll give you an example. In the late 1800s, when they had mass immigration here, the New York City and the New York State school system put together a curriculum to teach what it is to be an American citizen, what it is to be an American, and teach assimilation and cohesiveness to get along with other cultures. They actually put that into the school systems to help people transition from their countries. Like, for example, my grandparents came from Italy, and all the children were born here except for one. And after they got to school and they started to learn what it is to be an American, they went home and they actually refused to speak Italian at home. They told their mother and father, you have to become an American, you have to learn English. So it's all part of, like, you're in a new country or you're in a different country, you're not in your own country. Keep your culture, keep your roots, but you are an American first. So that's my opinion. Everybody has opinions. So when I say to people, who are you, John Murphy? I said, I'm an American of Irish and Italian descent. My allegiance, I don't even know what Ireland looks like. I've been to Italy just this past year. So, I mean, it's a very interesting country, but I love my country. This is my country,
And that's what it should be. That's the way it should be.
And I want everybody...
Your interpretation is correct, but is it carried out that way by the new flow of people coming in? Do they take the same forum that you're talking about, which is a solid one and the proper one?
Yeah, it's up to the us and the government to help people transition into this mass society. They're coming in ignorant, right? If you come to a new place, you're ignorant to the culture. You're ignorant to, you have your own culture. But if you help people to assimilate and we're all in the same ship, it's the worst thing you can possibly do is start poking holes in the bottom of the boat that we're all in. I mean, that's my...
It will sink.
Oh yeah, why should we all go down when we could actually save each other and do it the smart way, When
we'll get back in the Queen's Grapevine, we're going to continue talking about relationship. We're going to a little bit deeper now. We're going to start zeroing and some of the things that took place also under the de Blasio administration, which I think he started out by doing some great things and settling a lot of contracts that was left on the table. And now it seems like he's kind of losing a little bit of touch with the community and some problems with the police department. Again, this is going to be the sensitive side of it when we get back on the Queen's Grapevine. We'll be right back.
It's a very emotional day for our city. It's a very painful day for so many New Yorkers. That is the core reality. So many people in the city are feeling pain right now. And we're grieving, again, over the loss of Eric Garner, who was a father, a husband, a son, a good man who should be with us and isn't.
And we're back here in the Queen's Grapevine talking about race relationships right here in the tri-state area in New York City. We did the first 12 minutes and you heard Mr. Murphy and Mr. Williams express their feelings about certain issues. And now we get into the second part, which is the most sensitive part. Hank, this is a double question. Recently, there was a situation that took place in Staten Island, and a gentleman by the name of Mr. Gardner lost his life, which none of us look forward to another human being losing his life. There were various ways of looking at it in news media, the newspaper. Some saw it as an aggression against him, whereby the chokehold was applied and he died. Some look at it as he resisted arrest. When they tried to arrest him, he, instead of giving up peacefully, as the police department asked him to do, he did not. Others look at it like here are 6 or 7 cops getting down on a guy, and he's screaming and saying, "I can't breathe." It's difficult to take what side is the right side, because the police department supposedly are doing their job. And on the other side, a chokehold was used. Be as it may, the entire community was up in arms. Some took advantage of the situation in their own agenda. Others were really concerned. What is your opinion about everything that took place in terms of the entire spectrum?
Well, when we're talking about the Eric Garner case, I think one thing to remember is that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. You're talking about something that comes, on the heels of the much more publicized killing of Mike Brown over the summer. You're also talking about something that comes as a result of New York City's policy of stop and frisk and the revived focus on these fairly low-level so-called quality of life crimes.
That has ordinary citizens squaring off with the NYPD on a daily basis. Opposition to the stop and frisk program has swelled in recent days and weeks. Several police officers themselves have blown the whistle on the program, saying that the department is forcing them to meet quotas to provoke innocent civilians.
But I think a lot of what you're seeing is, yes, it's the case itself, and there's the fact that it was caught on tape, and there's simple outrage at the fact that you have a man saying that he can't breathe over and over and over again. And none of that is actually honored. If you look at the tapes, even after the paramedics come, there really isn't any attempt to even try to revive him or help him, other than take him into the ambulance. And I think that's the thing that people responded to on an extremely visceral level. In terms of everything else, well, resisting arrest is actually an extremely low level offense. Selling cigarettes, if in fact that's what he was doing, that's what they charged him with. That's an extremely minor offense too. So I think the bigger issue is everything that it brought out in terms of the police community relationships, how the police actually relate to the wider community, and whether or not it's even effective in all neighborhoods. But in terms of particulars of the case itself, there are some things that we're probably not going to find out until, if we ever hear what the grand jury heard. But on its face, I think what resonated with a lot of people was just the fact that, why does this man have to die for, one, these extremely minor offenses, and was there no way to actually deal with him, without killing him? And what is it that actually, what are the wider things that actually cause this? So a lot of it is Daniel Pantaleo and the case itself, but the wider issues that I think really upset people are these much larger issues of the so-called broken window strategy, of stop and frisk, and things like that. And that's what a lot of that is what the discussion really is on right now.
Well, it's interesting. You're looking at that. One of the major issues that a lot of other people in the community feel, the fact that he resisted arrest led to what took place, because it seems like he was not in good health, and by resisting arrest, it got into a situation like that. What do you think took place on the circumstance out in Staten Island, Mr. Murphy?
Well, first of all, for that minor offense, nobody should lose their life. I'll go right there. That it got totally, out of control. Like you said, Mr. Williams, the circumstances got way beyond normal control. For the health is the problem. Well, he was doing a misdemeanor crime. They tell him they wanted to arrest him, for this low-level crime. He started to resist arrest. His health conditions, the conditions there were terrible with his health. So, and then the taking down with a chokehold was probably not necessary. They should have just coaxed him into obeying. When you're being approached by a police officer and they tell you that they want you to turn around, put your hands behind your back, that's what you should be doing. But to lose your life like that is and then not have the proper medical care, either by Mr. Gardner didn't have his own nebulizer, and the ambulance, I don't know why they didn't go immediately into medical emergency. That's where a lot of the investigation should be. And, a good looking into the procedure that they followed with the choke thing. Common sense is, if you got a person that looks to you to be very unhealthy, you should be evaluating that as your part of your procedures, So I think there's a lot of things that have to be looked at and looked at carefully without making accusations. And you know what we used to always say, you have this massive problem, okay, everybody acknowledge that that's a problem. But what do you do? Lessons learned. How do you solve this? How do you fix it? That's what I think should be done. Really, it's education on the community that when a police officer tells you, whether you agree with them or not, to, you know, like, put your hands behind your backs. I'm not looking forward to that day ever in my life, but if it happens, I'm going to obey. I'm not going to fight and make them, you know, like, hurt me more, or I'll get my day in court.
Well, that's a very interesting point on both sides of you. Obviously, I will not give an opinion, but I will say this, that if the police department was trained properly, they should have been able to take him down without using the chokehold. We're talking about 6 or 7 guys against one guy. Obviously, his health played a very, very important part into this, how he lost his life, because you could hear him clearly saying, "I can't breathe." Now let's go back to one thing, Mr. William. Were you surprised at the reaction of the mayors?
Not at all. I think De Blasio realized, number one, you know, why he was elected, and part of, you know, and a good part of that really, quite honestly, came down to the policy of stop and frisk. And there were large sections of the Black and Latino community that have been saying for years, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem. And that was a good part of it. That was a good part of his base. And I think it was, I think a lot of people were, you know, were reassured in terms of de Blasio's initial reaction to it. And instead of immediately going and casting aspersions on Garner, the one thing that came from him was sympathy. And granted, sympathy only goes so far, but I think people actually needed to hear that it meant something to de Blasio. And that was, you know, and I think that was what we got. What a lot of people are a little bit discouraged by is, you know, in terms of whether or not how much systemic change there's going to be, and possibly even how much leverage he has to actually do systemic change in the police department to change a lot of what's going on. And that's the big question. That's the big question that's at play now.
Well, folks, we got into the end of the first program, talking about race relations. Very interesting indeed. Obviously, we're very sorry that the human being lost his life. We understand the intention of what the mayor was trying to do from the beginning, but things are out of control right now with him and the police department, and that's something that has to be fixed from a community standpoint of view. When we get back in part 2 of the Queen's Grapevine, we will continue talking about the de Blasio administration, the community issues, and the police department, and more importantly, how do we get to an understanding to work as people in the community as one for the betterment of men, women, children, and our own community.